Playing Silent Hill 2 again. I must be losing my mind. But then I guess you have to be a little crazy to be in Silent Hill in the first place. Now, you'd think it would have made more sense to have started last year with the first game, or wait till next year to do a 20-year anniversary on Silent Hill 2. But then, hey, I'm a small channel. I'm kind of like a weed growing up between the cracks of other people's more popular content, so gotta do what I gotta do. So, welcome to part 1 of my guided tour through Silent Hill 2. You may have heard before that the novel Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky was a huge inspiration for Team Silent when making Silent Hill 2. Now, I did not know this at all when I first played the game, and I had to read the book as part of a summer reading program the summer before, and actually, after playing through the game, I still had no idea that there was a connection. You'll see as I explain it briefly how it's not extremely similar. But the main similarity is that protagonist of the book, Rodion, he kills someone under his own justifications and then feels immense guilt throughout the story of the novel. And this controls all of his actions from then, and his sort of experiences punishing himself for his crime is the main drive of the novel, much like Silent Hill 2 in James's situation. Now, beyond that, there are only a few similarities or traits carried over to characters. The plot doesn't really follow in a similar structure, but one of those is the character of Sonia in the book, who is a very chaste and pious woman who goes into prostitution to help the finances of her family. And this is sort of portrayed in a very on-the-nose way in the dichotomy between Mary and Maria. But also there's an interesting aspect of Sonia is a friend of the woman who Rodion kills at the beginning of the novel. And she still forgives him and keeps his secret, and this is similar to the way, if you get the Leave ending, Laura forgives James for killing Mary, even though she was her friend, and she, empathizes with that he must have done it because Mary was very sick and suffering, and forgives him and leaves with him in the end. And that is sort of very similar to Sonia's path, so that character has traits that appear in several characters in this game. Now, other than that, there is an aspect of where Rodion's mother, who is sick and dying throughout the novel, she has these moments of clarity where she seems to know exactly what his crime is and what he's going through. And that is often portrayed in these sort of rants that Angela and Maria will sort of shout at James, and they seem to know exactly what's going on and what to say to reflect his situation and inner turmoil, even though he doesn't often give voice to it, and that is similar to those scenes in the novel. But other than that, it's not directly similar, and it's actually, there are numerous references to Aki Kaurismaki's 1983 film adaptation of Crime and Punishment, where the protagonist works in a slaughterhouse, and actually this is very clearly visually referenced in the boss fight with Eddie in the Historical Society, and I may go more into detail with that later, but I highly recommend checking it out. Not only is it a great film to help you appreciate Silent Hill 2 more, but also Aki Kaurismaki has a number of awesome movies that I would highly recommend you watch, so it's a great introduction to that director. Now, that'll about wrap it up for the primer on Crime and Punishment. I will probably refer back to both the novel and that movie adaptation in particular as I do future episodes. But for now, let's start the tour. So, this video, it's basically going to be a series of videos, a playthrough of the game, but I'm going to be adding commentary where I talk about how the game was developed, how the game engine works, a lot of interesting lore tidbits, and also some fun fan theories that are relevant to specific parts of the game as I go through them. And I'm going to be talking about the areas as I go through them. So we're starting out in the outskirts of town, where James is blocked from driving any further into town and has to run down from the observation deck towards Toluca Lake to try and make it into town. Now, one interesting thing about this part, if you didn't watch the Boundary Break episode on Silent Hill 2, there's not actually anything behind me. You can hear noises behind you when you're running down the trail. Even if you zoom out, look around, look all over the place in the camera, see what models are loaded, there's no monster model following me at all. It's just sound effects. We're about to come up on the first save point here in the well, and there is actually a fan theory that I find kind of interesting, but it's a very speculative one. There's not much evidence for, but that all of the save points are places where James could potentially commit suicide, this first one being the well here. And I just found that kind of interesting. First real location here after the observation deck is the church, where it has its own things to speculate about. This chapel and cemetery here are located right on this sort of little inlet on the Toluca Lake here. You can see that right beyond James and Angela in this scene. And for pretty much no reason beyond that, a lot of fans have speculated that this cemetery holds victims who have drowned in Toluca Lake, since there are numerous references to that throughout the game. And so that's sort of an interesting thing if that is something that's being referenced here. But beyond the fact that there is a cemetery and a little chapel here that's right on the edge of the lake with no other explanation, there's not really anything specific to point to that. But it is just a kind of cool little thing to find in an area to meet Angela in. Now we move on from the church and cemetery to the outskirts of the town proper. Now, an interesting thing about this area is there are numerous suggestions that South Vale was a sort of rough and tumble, kind of rednecky area before suburban houses and businesses were put down as Silent Hill expanded over the decades. And one of the first kind of fun references to that is anyone who's a fan of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies will recognize sort of an iconic scene where Leatherface leaves the chainsaw running in the logs as a distraction. Of course, he's right behind the city slickers. And so there's a reference to that. Now, this is the original. This is what the sign is supposed to look like. Silent Hill Ranch, if you've only played the HD collection. I'm sorry to even bring that up. But you can see there's these sort of rural houses and farms here as you go through. Barbed wire fence on my right. And there are a number of other things that you are going to see in this area that kind of suggest, almost like a truck stop edge of town kind of feeling. Again, in this part you hear noises, but there's not actually a model of any sort of enemy or anything stalking you. It's just sound effects being triggered as you walk past a certain point. Alright, let's do a quick map check here. So at the lower right you can see the observation deck where we started, and James does his monologue at the beginning of the game. Now, an interesting thing here, you can see Nathan Avenue, the road that we were coming in on. There's actually dashed lines there to show that the road has actually been closed for some time. It's not part of James's imagination or the illusion he's seeing in Silent Hill. It's actually something that is supposed to be happening in the real world that other people are aware of. And then from there, we went down to, you can see that little sort of arc area where the trail widens. That's the church, and it's right on that little cove of the lake. And then we proceeded down the trail, and we're about to pass back under Nathan Avenue. We're headed into town on Wiltse Road. Now don't worry, at the end of this episode I will show a zoomed out picture of the map and add in the things that were not marked on it that we've passed, like Silent Hill Ranch, for example. This transition brings us to a new part of the map, both in James' actual map of the town and in the game engine itself. Now, it's interesting to note that if you kind of step back and look at the overpass of Nathan Avenue, it looks kind of cracked and nasty, so kind of makes sense that they're restoring it. Now, you'll see we have moved to a zoomed in section of the map that it shows now. But also, the sections before were each smaller bits of map, but this, from here on out, is actually part of the map of South Vale, so there's quite a large section in here that is all one contiguous map without loading screens. Now, an interesting thing over here, this thing to my right is Silent Hill Farms, and there's actually a huge field of corn here on the other side of this aqueduct here. This area is interesting because a number of these little side roads and paths are not marked at all on your map. Now, this is our first really interesting thing. The Roadrunner. This appears to be closed down, and we don't really hear anything about this, but there's a sign we're going to see later that a lot of people theorize is connected to this, and a lot of the businesses that have closed down as the image of South Vale has been changed. There are a few references to mayors cleaning up South Vale. And I think that's evidenced in some of the changeover of the type of businesses and what the Roadrunner appears to have been. So you can see these little side roads here are not on the map, but it could be they're just part of the farm there. They're just like the farm access roads, because you can see it. This over here is Silent Hill Farms, the huge cornfield and everything. I remember when I first played the games, looking at these bags, I thought they looked so realistic on my little tube TV. I was just blown away. I was like, wow, that is the most realistic garbage I've ever seen. Some fine garbage. So we go in here, and there's this just like crazy survivalist shack, and they've got barbed wire around the side, and this crazy cinder block wall here on the front. None of this stuff is marked on the map. So it's kind of just left up to your imagination exactly what these other things were, and that clearly was just someone's residence who didn't want to be on the map, so it's pretty obvious why that one's not marked. Doesn't really make sense why that one is closed off, because it looks to be a dead end anyway. There's no reaction or anything on the phone. Oh, I totally skipped this med kit. I love how there's blood on the sign, and it just obscures thank you or something for your business. I mean, presumably it doesn't say F you for your business, but I mean, maybe that's the joke. That's what the blood is covering up. Maybe one of the artists wrote, like, screw you for your business, and the producers were like, no, they put some blood on that or something. That's not acceptable. But that's my theory. That one's from me right there. Now this is funny. Look at this car. It's clearly an old Honda Civic, and the Honda logo is clearly visible. So I thought that was pretty funny. A lot of these cars are actual car models that they didn't really do much to change, but that one's pretty blatant, where you can still see the Honda logo on the front of it. Now, as we come out here on the street and encounter the blood, it's funny. Most people would probably just follow the trail of blood, as I did the first time that I played the game, but it does, of course, actually compel you to follow the trail of blood and go after our little buddy here. But, you know what? Let's just give it a test. So, I try to go to the south, and it actually does let me go for a little bit this way. But that's because it's a dead end. It's not even a dead end that opens up later at night. It's just a straight up dead end here. Totally worth coming over here, though. Skip that med pack. I'll take this health drink. If I try to go any other direction, it doesn't let me go far at all, and it just forces me to go the direction that the patient demon went. It's always a good idea to run along the sidewalk, because there's often health drinks and things just littered over here in doorways and things. I'll talk a little bit more about this part of town later, but I'm going to go back over here down Box Road to more of the sort of rural outskirts that I'm focusing on for this part before I end this episode. I always thought that texture looked really awesome again on my little tiny tube TV. Now I'm going to go in here, even though I'm not going to save, because if I bypass shinies, I know people will freak out. Nothing else interactable in here. You can't open the doors. They don't even come up as locked or anything. It's just save point with a couple of health items. Okay, there we go. Not skipping any shinies without calling it out. Now we go down here and we cross one more time under Nathan Avenue, which you can see it's under construction for a long section. It looks like they've been doing this for a while. So again, this is not just part of James' delusion. Oh, hello there, sir. I didn't realize that you were, rubbing one out in this alley. I thought this was unoccupied. I'll be on my way. Oh, you're gonna be like that about it, huh? Eh? Alright. Oh, I'm always up for a hobo fight. I lived on the streets in Philly. Got me a stick? You know what? Nah, a stick isn't enough. Here we go. So, funny thing about the chainsaw. In this cinema, it puts the stick back in my hand, and this is actually a funny distinction. So, technically, the game killed this enemy. In all other situations, if you kill enemies and you stand over them with the chainsaw, James will yell out a sort of a battle cry. It sounds like this. But over this enemy, and a couple of others that are killed in cinematic scenes, James will not do that. Even if you kind of move him around, nudge him, interrupt his animation, he'll just do his other idle animations, and he will not do his chainsaw battle cry scream. Now don't worry, on the next segment, I will go on a chainsaw rampage, and you will get to see the battle cry. But first, I have to finish up this episode and talk a little bit more about the sort of outskirt area of Silent Hill. Now, it's interesting because we're going to see this billboard I'm going to walk by in a moment. Now, this billboard here is really torn up and it looks like it's old and, it's been torn apart. But people have looked at the texture and it kind of looks like there are words that say truck stop and possibly Roadrunner. So this kind of suggests to us that the Roadrunner used to be this truck stop that also offered prostitution. And this was one of the sort of businesses that existed in South Vale when it was more of a rural area. And since then, the apartment buildings and little houses and businesses have been sort of encroaching on that. And none of this stuff is even shown on the map out here. So it's just another interesting wrinkle of the visual storytelling of Silent Hill and its layout and design. Let's take the game's map now and add the things that we've found exploring that are not shown on the official map of the town. And you can see a kind of pattern here that the cemetery that could possibly house the victims of the various disasters on the lake that are mentioned throughout the game, a ranch, a farm, and the Roadrunner, which may or may not be a house of ill repute. These sort of paint a picture of a rural kind of red light district that used to exist in South Vale that's been paved over by more modern development in more recent decades. So that's the thing I wanted to highlight in this area, and next episode we'll move on to the more main South Vale area and the apartment complex as I talk about the interesting little lore tidbits and hidden things about that area. Thanks for watching. This has been my guided tour of Silent Hill 2.